Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you. Thank you so much for taking some time off on your Saturday to do some
Good
personal
morning.
enrichment. We really appreciate that and look forward to having a great meeting with you this weekend. So, Brian, I believe you're up first.
All right, yeah, sounds good. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Brian Leonard. I'm an associate professor in the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources, as well as the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. I actually just moved here. I was at Arizona State University in the School of Sustainability for 8 years. And before that, I did my PhD in economics at UC Santa Barbara. So I do environmental economics for a living. So my research is all about property rights and the environment. I do a lot of work on different energy resources, both conventional kind of hydrocarbon stuff, but then also renewable energy, and a lot of work on property rights to land and water and how that affects everything from agriculture to wildlife migrations and things of that nature. So I'm also a long time sort of FTE affiliate. I actually went through the program as a student in high school and have been working with FTE over the last probably I think I started during the pandemic, so probably the last 4 years or so, doing some online and in-person programs. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I will say what we're going to talk about in the next 4 or 5 hours is like a semester-long course. So there's a lot of material condensed in here. Some of it will be review for some of you, some of it won't. I have a tendency to talk a little quick because I did debate for 8 years. So if I'm going too fast, slow me down. And maybe John and Debbie can help me out and keep an eye kind of on the chat in case I miss anything. Feel free to interrupt with questions. But if there's not any questions to start off with, I will go ahead and dive in. Let me make sure I get this right with my screen share. Are you all looking at my slides? Yes, awesome, great. Okay, so this is our program on the fundamentals of environmental economics. It's a program we've been running for a number of years, and just recently we've adapted and made like a week-long version of this that students can attend in the summer as well. So that might be something that could be of interest to some of your students. Let's make sure I can advance my slides. There we go. Okay, so the mission of this program is to familiarize participants with a range of environmental economic concepts. And then the point I would really emphasize is to provide a critical thinking framework for analyzing environmental issues and policies. So we will talk about, a handful of particular environmental issues, but this is really what I always tell my students: economics is a way of thinking, and you can think of it as like a toolbox for addressing issues. So hopefully the concepts and things that we talk about here today can be applied to other topics besides the particular ones that I talk about. Okay. So the vision of the program is that students would graduate from high school with the skills that enable them to critically analyze environmental economic issues. And those issues are going to change over time. Climate change, which is something that we'll talk about today, is obviously something that's been at the forefront of news and policy over the last few years. That's probably going to change a little bit with the Trump administration, but there's a lot of other issues that both academics and folks in the media and government are worried about, whether that's water scarcity, biodiversity loss, land use change, all of these things. So the hope would be that we can equip students with the tools to think about any of those things because kind of the pressing issue of the day is likely to change over time. Okay, so to do that, I would be remiss teaching in EFL if I didn't at least quickly go through the economic reasoning propositions. So these are 5 propositions that kind of undergird all of the programming that we do at FTE. We would go over these with the students in an EFL program in the summer. We'd go over them in the environment program in the summer. I'm sure most of you, if you've been to an FTE program before, have seen these, but just to quickly rehash these things, and then we'll see how they kind of play out in the context of the environment over the course of the rest of today. ERP number 1 is that people choose, and individual choices are the source of social outcomes. And that's going to be a really, really important principle for thinking about kind of where environmental problems and environmental dilemmas come from, is that it's the aggregation of a bunch of individual choices. And those choices are necessitated by scarcity, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go through it. Number 2 is that choices impose costs. So people are going to receive benefits and incur costs when they make decisions. And we're going to talk about important differences in who maybe bears those benefits and costs or receives those benefits and costs, and why thinking about it that way is important when we think about environmental challenges. Number three is that people respond to incentives in predictable ways. And this is, I would say, like one of the pillars of economics, is that if we apply the economic way of thinking, we can make predictions about the way people are going to react when we change their incentives. And we'll talk about what that means for the design of policy. Okay, somehow I'm gonna stop touching my mouse because it keeps flipping me around. We're gonna use just the keyboard. Okay. Number four is that institutions are the rules of the game that influence choices. And so we're gonna talk about at kind of a high level how institutions influence behavior that affects the environment, and then we'll get into kind of the nitty-gritty of particular laws, policies, and institutions that are useful for thinking about solving environmental dilemmas. And we'll really do that with climate change as kind of an operating example in the last lecture today. And then number five, understanding based on knowledge and evidence imparts value to opinions. And so this is one I always emphasize with students either in the summer programs or with my own students in the classroom. There are a lot of strongly held beliefs, strongly held opinions, and different values when it comes to talking about the environment. And so this issue in particular, maybe more than when we're talking about something like tariffs or some other economic sort of concept or area, we really need to remember to think based on knowledge and evidence and use the economic way of thinking and not have it all just be about kind of our opinions. All right, so with that, I want to dive into lesson one, which is really just to try to lay out the fundamentals. I want to talk about some key terms and concepts and sort of the economic approach for thinking about the environment. So for those of you that have been through FTE programming in the past, some of this is going to be a little bit of a review at the beginning. So the objective of this particular lecture is to provide a working understanding of the major economic concepts as they relate to environmental economic issues. So just to give you kind of the vocabulary to think about these things and diagnose these things. So we got to start at square one. What is economics? Can anybody jump in either in the chat, or if you want to just unmute yourself and jump in, somebody give me a definition of economics. Nobody?
I would say the study of scarcity.
The study of scarcity. Okay, I like it. Anybody else? Study of choices, study of allocation of scarce resources. Yeah, okay, so that's going to come up in 2 slides exactly. So I always go over this with students because, and the sort of anecdote I tell is that when I travel to give a seminar or a talk or something, and I get in the back of an Uber and I tell the driver I'm an economist, they immediately ask me about inflation or about the stock market or some macroeconomic thing, and I tell them I have absolutely no idea. So a lot of people, those things are the purview of economics. That's macroeconomics. It's not what I do. But for a lot of people, they think that economics is sort of the study of the stock market or of how to do business or how to make money or inflation or things like that. And I put a few other pictures on here to sort of emphasize that economics is a lot broader than that. It's a lot more powerful than that. So on the left here, I've got a little family. Gary Becker, a famous Nobel Prize winning economist from the University of Chicago. One of the things he did is he developed this whole body of thought about the economics of the household and the economics of the family. So using economics to think about choices like how many kids should I have? Should I send them to private school or public school or daycare? And we can use the economic way of thinking to think about those kind of decisions. I've got a longbow here at the top. A friend of mine, Doug Allen, actually an economic historian, has a really neat paper using economics to understand why Great Britain used the longbow for a period of years when no other country was using it, and then suddenly stopped using it. It's kind of this thing that's puzzled historians for a long time, and he used economics to sort of answer that question. And then on the right here, I've got a picture of the Colorado River Basin, which is a area that I spend a lot of time studying and thinking about water scarcity issues along the Colorado River and how to deal with that scarcity both between states, so conflicts between, say, California and Arizona, but then also within states. So all of those things are things that economics can help us study because economics is the study of how individuals and groups, and the group part's going to be critical today, study of how individuals and groups make choices about how to use scarce resources to achieve their goals. So it's the study of choice under scarcity in the pursuit of goals. Which brings us to unpacking scarcity a little bit. So scarcity comes from the fact that desires are unlimited, right? There's always something more I might want to do. If I read every book in a series that I'm satisfied with, maybe I want to read a different series, maybe I want to go watch a movie. We have unlimited desires, but at the end of the day, the resources we have to put towards those desires are fundamentally limited. Land is limited, and in sort of classical economics, land was kind of the stand-in for all natural resources. We thought about labor, capital, and land could be water, could be oil, could be anything. It just means sort of natural resources. And even if we somehow, went to Mars, went to the moon, developed a bunch more natural resources, found new natural resources, we're still going to be limited in human ingenuity and also in time. So at the end of the day, we live in a world of scarcity where we have limited resources to put towards potentially unlimited wants. And so that's going to necessitate choice. And the reason for that is that any given resource, whether it's your time or a piece of land or a gallon of water, is going to have more than one valuable use. And so we're going to have to make a choice about what use to choose or what use to put a resource to. And so that really, at a very basic level, and somebody put this right in the chat, economics is about trying to understand the framework for thinking about what is the best use of a given resource. And this could look like things that we might normally associate with economics, or that most people would associate with economics, like how should a household or a firm or a city or a government spend its budget. We're probably going to see a lot of discussion about that in the news over the next couple of years. I had to sit down and think about which topics should we talk about in a half-day seminar. As I told you, I've got at least a semester's worth of material here, and that's unlimited relative to the time that we have of just 3 lectures. So how am I going to best allocate those 3 lectures? And then thinking more specifically about some environmental applications, one thing that, say, California and Arizona grapple with a lot is, should we be using water to grow crops like alfalfa or almonds, or should we be allocating it towards cities and municipalities so that people can take showers or water their lawns or things like that? And then another question that we often grapple with is how much pollution is too much? At what point do we want to cut back production, cut back things like driving to have less pollution in the air? And so the point is, the environment is fundamentally is an economic good at the end of the day. So even though we might typically think about economics as being about choices that firms make and things having to do with the stock market, the environment is actually a great example of an economic good, because environmental quality is fundamentally scarce. There are alternative uses for water, for land, for clean air, whatever it is. And we have to choose among those competing uses. And so the upshot of all this, and this is kind of, I lay this out with the EFL students in the summer, but I also lay it out with my undergrads, is that economics is critical for helping us think more clearly about the environment, because most environmental challenges come down to thinking about, well, what is the best use of this scarce resource, and what resource it is might be different in different contexts, but that's fundamentally an economic question. So 2 really important questions that we want to ask about how to make those choices are: how should we make those choices? How should individuals make those choices? How should society make those choices? And as soon as we ask, how should society make those choices, we kind of find ourselves asking the question, well, who should get to decide, right? How are we going to decide these things, and who should have a say, who has a voice? So I've given an example here to help unpack this a little bit. This is an example that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I spent a lot of time outside of Bozeman, Montana, and kind of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. If any of you have watched the show Yellowstone, I stopped watching it several seasons ago, but there are a lot of interesting, factually inaccurate things about that show, but it captures some of the basic tensions in that part of the world very well, which is that there's a real debate going on right now. A lot of people are wanting to move there. And so there's a real debate about, well, should we allocate land to more subdivisions, more houses for people to live there, because it's very, very expensive. The median house price is like $800,000. Or do we want to preserve open space and ranches and things like on the right? And so you could imagine, how should we make that decision for like a marginal acre of land or a marginal farm? Should we turn it into a subdivision? Should we leave it as open space? And then you think about all the different people that are impacted by that decision. So there's people that already live in a place like Bozeman. There's the person that owns the land, and they're thinking about their profit from keeping it as open space versus selling it to a developer. There's the developer who's thinking about how much money they could make by building and selling all these houses. There's people that want to move to Bozeman that would love it if housing was more affordable. And then there's all the other people that don't own that particular piece of land, but do live nearby, and they might prefer to look at a field as opposed to looking at a bunch of houses. And so it's a very, very complicated question, even if we ask something as simple as, should we turn this acre of land into a half a dozen houses, or should we leave it as a green field? We really need a framework for thinking about, well, how should we make that choice? And given all the different people that are affected by that decision, who should get to decide, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we want to unpack today. And that's just one particular example that has a lot of the features that many environmental challenges have. So when we're thinking about that first question, how should we decide? A fundamental concept, and I always tell my students this is like the one thing, if they understand nothing else from my classes, the one thing I want them to understand is the notion of opportunity cost. And opportunity cost really comes down to the fact that when we choose one thing, we are necessarily, by definition, denying something else. So by choosing to, spend my Saturday teaching you all about environmental economics, I've chosen not to go fishing, for instance, or I've chosen not to hang out at home with my 10-month-old baby. And so we would say that the opportunity cost of a decision is the value of the next best foregone alternative. These are two phrases I actually stole from John. So one way to think about it is that the opportunity cost of a decision is the opportunity lost. It's the thing that you gave up, or in other words, to choose is to refuse. By choosing one thing, I'm giving up another thing. A critical point about opportunity cost, though, is that it doesn't include every other possible alternative, everything else we could have done. It's just the next best alternative. So if we go back to my example of this acre of land in Montana, and we're choosing, should we leave it as open space or should we turn it into a subdivision? Let's say we decide to build the subdivision. The opportunity cost is just the next best use, which may have been open space. There's probably a dozen other things we could have built on that piece of land. We could have built a shopping mall. We could have built a zoo. We could have built an amusement park. But if those things aren't the next best alternative, they're not really part of the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is the next best thing. So like I said, there's lots of things I could be doing today instead. I could have gone fishing. I could have stayed home and hung out with my baby. I maybe could have gone hiking. Probably what I would have actually done is stayed home and helped with the baby. So that's my opportunity cost of being here today. It's not all of those things. It's just the next best thing. And as economists, we often think about that as the value of that alternative. So it's not just kind of what I would have done, but the value of what I would have done when we're thinking about the cost of making a choice. And that's going to be really critical when we think about the environment, because any given resource is going to have these different uses. And so we want to know, well, what's the next best use? Are we going to use, air to absorb pollution? Or are we going to use it to breathe? Are we going to use water to grow crops? Or are we going to use it to take showers, et cetera? So given that basic idea of, okay, well, when we make a choice, we're incurring this cost, this opportunity cost, how should we make those choices? And another critical component of the economic way of thinking is to recognize that choices are made at the margin. And when I say at the margin, I just mean thinking about the benefit or the cost of doing a little bit more of an activity. If I spend another hour of my time teaching versus fishing, if I spend another dollar on food versus, I don't know, entertainment, something like that. And so we would call the marginal cost of an activity the added cost of one more. So it's the change in the cost. How much more cost am I going to incur if I continue doing this thing for one more hour, or if I make one more unit, if I'm a firm or something like that. And of course, the marginal benefit then is the added benefit, or the change, the additional benefit of doing a little bit more of an activity. So we think about choice, we think about making comparisons between the marginal cost of doing a little bit more of an activity versus the marginal benefit of doing a little bit more of an activity at the margin. And then another important sort of thing to keep in mind, and this is going to be especially true when we're making decisions about the environment, is that all costs and benefits are in the future. So decisions are made based on expected costs and expected benefits, and sometimes the actual costs and benefits are going to turn out to be a little bit different than what we expected. But when we're thinking through these things about how should we make choices, we think about choices based on expectations about costs and benefits. And there's actually, whole fields of economics that think about how uncertainty in those expectations changes the way we make choices, but we're not really going to get into that today. We might get into it a little bit with climate change. Okay, so we've got the notion of opportunity cost. We recognize that choices are made at the margin. So then how should we choose? Well, it turns out the optimal use of a resource occurs where the marginal benefit of using a little bit more of that resource for a particular use is just equal to the marginal cost. And an important thing to keep in mind is that when we're talking about marginal cost, that includes the opportunity cost. So in other words, I should keep using a resource up until the point where the marginal benefit in that particular use is just equal to the marginal cost or the next best foregone alternative. So I have this example here of a kid playing in the sprinkler. One of the things that cities across the West are really grappling with is the amount of water that's used sort of by residents. And it turns out most household water use is outdoor water use to grow your lawn. And so we might think, some people want to approach this not at the margin and say, should we have grass or not? Should we have lawns or not? We would want to start with a marginal analysis of saying like, okay, well, what's the marginal benefit of using a little bit more water in household use to water your lawn or to just run the sprinkler for a couple hours to let the kids play in it versus the marginal cost of doing that. So it doesn't have to be this all or nothing thing of should we have grass or not, but it's a question of, okay, at the margin, at what point does using a little bit more water for household use start to be worth less to us than the next best alternative? So maybe the having some grass is worthwhile because the marginal benefit of doing that is really, really high. But as we use more and more water for things like grass and plants and running around, that marginal benefit is probably declining, while at the same time, you're pulling more and more water out of alternative uses and maybe making it more and more expensive to grow crops, for instance. And so we want to think about those trade-offs at the margin, which is going to bring us to sort of what I would say is the fundamental economic concept for understanding environmental challenges and problems about the environment. And everything I'm going to say about sort of solutions or policy later on is going to come from this basic notion, which is the notion of externalities. So an externality is a direct cost or benefit of an action that is not taken into account by the decision maker. And in particular, it's not borne by the decision maker. So it's when I make a choice and it creates a cost or benefit for somebody else besides me, and I don't think about that cost or benefit when I'm making my decision. We would call that an externality. So a negative externality is an external cost, and a positive externality we would call an external benefit. So this really, really matters. This is where environmental dilemmas come from. Because if we think about the optimal use of a resource, and we go back to that question of who should choose, we want to think about the social marginal cost and the social marginal benefit of the use of a resource. So if we're thinking about the optimal use of water, how much water should we have in cities versus in agriculture, we want to think about the costs and benefits to everybody at the margin and add all those up. And that's how we would figure out the best use of that resource. The problem is that's often not the way that the people who are actually making decisions about the use of resources make their decisions, because that marginal social cost is comprised of two components. It's comprised of the private marginal cost, so the costs that are borne by the people that are actually making the decisions. So if I'm choosing whether to let my kids run around in the sprinkler, the private marginal cost to me is just my water bill, which is actually in most places very low at the margin. The amount I pay for a little more water is not very much. And then there's an external marginal cost to that decision, which is that I'm, making water more scarce and pulling it out of some other alternative use. Similarly, when individuals make decisions, they're going to think about the private benefits to themselves. So I'm going to think about the benefits of having my kids run around in the sprinkler, and there may or may not be some external marginal benefit from my choice. So to give another example, actually, I'm going to punt on that because I'm going to have a picture of it in a couple of slides. But the key point here is that the optimal use of the resource, the criterion for determining the the use of the resource that maximizes net benefits to society is different than the criterion that individuals are choosing. So what we would want from a social perspective is that marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit, but often individuals are making choices based just on their private costs and benefits. And so when we have an activity that's subject to a negative externality, what that's going to mean is that there's a cost that's not being taken into account. And so we're going to tend to get too much of the activity than we otherwise would if people were fully taking all of the costs into account. And on the flip side, if we have an activity that's associated with a positive externality, we're going to tend to not get enough of that activity because the people making the choices are just going to think about the private marginal benefits to them and not the external benefits. So to give you some examples of these externalities, the canonical one in environmental economics that we talk about a lot is air pollution, or really any kind of pollution. So I have noise pollution here as well, the no loud music. But that when a firm is making a decision about producing widgets or shoes or whatever it is, or maybe they're making a decision about producing electricity, they're going to think about the marginal benefit to them of producing another unit of electricity, which is the revenue that they generate. And they're going to think about the marginal cost to them of generating that electricity. And that's just going to be, the cost of running the power plant. But there's this external cost, which occurs in the form of local air pollution, which can have a lot of health impacts, can make for smoggy days, et cetera. And then, there's potentially global negative externalities associated with that having to do with climate change. And so we're going to tend to get too much of these activities that generate air pollution relative to what would maximize the welfare of society, because the firms and individuals that are making decisions about how much electricity to use and how to produce it are only thinking about the private benefits and costs, not the external benefits and costs. And then I've got kind of a fun example on the bottom right, which is a guy smoking salmon. And there's actually a really fun example of a court case in Australia where this woman who is a vegetarian sued her neighbor because his hobby was to smoke fish, and she found it like morally reprehensible to always have to smell like this smoking fish flesh because she was an ardent vegetarian or vegan. The point is, that's a decision he was making, just thinking about the private benefits and cost to him. He enjoys the taste of smoked fish, and he's not taking into account the fact that it's like really bothering his neighbor when he does that. And so we maybe get more smoked fish than would be the case if we were thinking about maximizing the net benefits to both of them. On the flip side, a lot of activities generate positive externalities, and we might worry that we get less of those activities than we would if people were taking into account all of the external benefits that they're generating. So I just moved from my place in Phoenix, but one of my favorite examples to give is that when we moved into our house in Phoenix, it was painted, well, one of my neighbors called it baby shit yellow. It was like this mustard, awful yellow color. And it probably took us 3 or 4 months to get to the point where we were ready to repaint it and redo the landscaping or whatever. And we made that decision based on the cost and benefits to us, right? We didn't like having an ugly yellow house, but it's costly to pay somebody to come paint it. And we had to do some other things first. We had to replace the windows, et cetera. So it took some time. It turns out all of our neighbors really, really hated our yellow house. And I had people pulling over and thanking me for painting it white for about 6 months after we did that. So the point is, the choice we made to repaint our house from an ugly color to an appealing color generated this external benefit. It literally probably changed my neighbor's property values because we have this very prominent corner lot. And it used to be really ugly, and then it became this really pretty house. And we maybe would have done that sooner if we had taken into account the external benefits to all of our neighbors. The classic example in economics of an external benefit that has become pretty politicized in recent years, but the classic example is a vaccine. And the reason for that is when I go get a flu shot, I make that decision based on the costs and benefits to me. So I'm less likely to get the flu for having gotten the flu shot, which is why I would get it. Maybe the COVID shot, well, that's the political one, but when I get the COVID shot, I'm sick for like 2 days. So there's a real cost to me of getting it. There's, whatever risks associated with long-term impacts, but I know that if I go get a COVID booster, I'm going to be in bed for 2 days with a fever. So it's costly, but it's probably better than getting COVID. And so there's some benefit to me. But critically, there's an external benefit too, because if I'm less likely to get COVID and I'm less likely to get a severe case of COVID, I'm also less likely to pass it on to other people. And that's the whole logic of why the government tends to give away vaccines for free, or there were even some cities that were paying people. When I was in California visiting in-laws about this time last year, there were ads on TV that you could literally get paid like $100 to go get a flu and COVID shot. And the whole logic behind that is that there's an external benefit of if you don't get it, you're less likely to pass it on. And so it creates benefits for everybody in your community when you're inoculated from a disease. So that's a classic example of an external benefit. And then another classic example that I often use with my students is that I prefer to bike commute to work. When I lived in Phoenix, it used to be that the cost to me had to do with how hot it was outside. Now that I'm in Laramie, the cost to me is how cold it is outside. But when I'm making that decision, I'm sort of thinking about how quick I need to get to campus. Am I going to get a little bit of exercise? These kind of things. I'm not necessarily thinking about the external benefits I'm generating by riding my bike, which have to do with, not producing emissions, not contributing to traffic, et cetera, et cetera. And so the point is we probably have fewer people riding bikes than would be optimal from a social perspective because they're making that decision based on the private costs and benefits to them and not based on the external benefits to the rest of society. So the key questions we want to ask then, given this framework, is why do people make the choices that they do? And if those choices have negative consequences, what can we do to change those choices or behavior? So if people are running around generating a bunch of negative externalities or failing to create positive externalities that would increase welfare in society, what can we do? What can economics tell us about how we might induce people to change choices or behaviors? And I almost gave it away by saying incentive. So an incentive is just an anticipated reward or penalty associated with a choice. And one of the fundamental pillars of economics, one of our economic reasoning propositions, is that people respond to incentives in predictable ways. And so what that means is that if I change incentives, I can change behavior. So we think that if the reward of doing an activity goes up, people are going to be more likely to engage in that activity. If the penalties associated with doing an activity go up, people are going to do less of that activity. And so at a very basic level, that's how we go about sort of addressing these externality challenges and these environmental problems, is to change the incentives that people have. So if currently it's the case that I don't really have an incentive to worry about the pollution associated with driving my car around, maybe we could imagine a policy or a different way of organizing things so that there's some penalty associated with generating a negative externality, or there's some reward associated with generating a positive externality. Which brings us to institutions. So at a really high level, institutions are the rules of the game that shape economic outcomes by determining incentives. So it's basically, you could think about everything from formal law and policy, things that a speed limit, gas taxes, these kinds of things, but then also everything down to social norms within your community that sort of make some behaviors taboo versus others being acceptable. So it's anything that shapes your incentives and therefore has an impact on the economic outcomes that we see as a society. One of the fundamental institutions that we really emphasize at FTE is the idea of the rule of law. And the rule of law says that the law should govern a nation and include those governing as well as those who govern, which is just to say that you should be subject to the law and the law should apply whether or not you happen to be in political office and somebody helping make laws, or somebody who's just a citizen. And that's in contrast to, frankly, what we've had for most of human history, which is either the rule of force, which is just might makes right, or the rule of man. The king is in charge and the king gets to make the law and he gets to do what he wants, and there's no external law governing the king's behavior. We've obviously moved away from that over the last several hundred years of human history, and doing so has provided a stable and predictable environment for both individual and social choice. That's important because it prevents resources and money from being diverted to basically trying to influence the government as opposed to trying to do something productive in society. We're not going to get too much more into that today, but that is one of the things that FTE really emphasizes as one of the critical institutions for a prosperous society and for economic growth. But economic growth isn't really going to be our focus today. One of the critical institutions that we will talk about quite a bit today is property rights. So property rights grant the owner the ability to buy, sell, trade, or derive income from the asset. And the asset might be land, it might be a natural resource, it might be their entrepreneurial talent, it could be your time, whatever it is. And you can contrast that to what we would call common ownership, which is to say, you may not have the ability to derive an income from a piece of land if you don't own it. If it's held in common, you might not be able to buy it or sell it. Multiple people might be able to utilize it. You might not be able to exclude others from utilizing it. John's going to unpack some of those things and what they mean for environmental quality, sort of in your first activity. But one of the things that's true across economics, but perhaps especially in the context of environmental economics, is that property rights are fundamental to shaping incentives, because the ability to buy, sell, or trade or derive income from an asset is really going to change the incentives, the penalties and the rewards from how you use that asset, right? If you aren't the one that's bearing the penalties of using an asset in an irresponsible way, say over depleting it, then you have no incentive to, say, conserve that asset. And so that's going to be really important. The final institution that I want to mention is a market. So a market is just any place, and it could be a physical place or a conceptual place, where buyers and sellers come together to exchange goods and services. So I have a literal farmer's market here on the left-hand side. That's always something that's nice and tangible and easy for students to think about. It's a grocery store, it's whatever it is, it's where you go and you pay money and you get goods, right? But there's also much more kind of like complex and abstract forms of markets that we use to allocate goods. And so on the right-hand side here, what I have is a schematic from the federal incentive auction for broadcast spectrum, which was run in the mid-2000s. And basically the government ran an auction so that to different firms like AT&T or Time Warner Cable or HBO or whoever to buy different bands of the electromagnetic spectrum, which allow them to broadcast and allow you to use your cell phone or turn on the radio and hear something or anything like that. All that to say, that's a resource that the government regulates who gets to use which bandwidth so that they don't interfere with each other. And they chose to use an auction, which is a type of market, right? The person willing to pay the most for a given band of spectrum is the one who got that band of spectrum. So the point is, markets are an allocation mechanism. It's a way of determining who gets what based on who's willing to pay the most. And they can be simple, like a farmer's market, or they can be very, very complex. So when we put all that together, if we have the rule of law and we have complete property rights and we have markets, those three things in combination lead to an efficient use of resources. And when I say an efficient use of resources, I mean a use of resources that maximizes the net benefits to society of how we allocate things. And so if we're making the best use of scarce resources, that's going to tend to lead to economic growth. If we're always kind of putting things to their highest valued use, there's an incentive to innovate and use things more efficiently. That's how we get more productivity. More productivity for the same amount of input is basically the definition of economic growth. It's also true that across society and across time, property rights tend to become more complete as the marginal benefit of more clearly defining those rights exceeds the marginal cost. So historically, right, we didn't have, say, property rights to land because land was really, really abundant and there weren't very many people. And as land became more scarce relative to people, we come up with things like demarcation and fencing to divide land, and then people have more complete property rights to their land. They can exclude other people. So now maybe I have an incentive to build a house or a dwelling or something else. And those things tend to evolve over time. The critical point here is that externalities, external costs and external benefits, happen when we have missing property rights or incomplete property rights. So if there's some flow of benefits or costs from the way I use an asset that is not well defined, who has the right to that benefit or that cost, that's basically what an externality is. It's a benefit or a cost that's floating around out there and it's not being transacted over. And so over time, there are things that generate externalities that maybe aren't worth worrying about at first because the externalities aren't that severe and we don't worry about fully defining the property rights. But then as the externalities become more costly to society, we more completely define those property rights to try to internalize those externalities so that the people making the decisions bear all of the costs and benefits of those decisions. And we'll see some examples of how you might do that when we talk about climate policy in particular. So zooming out a little bit, I said we're not going to talk a lot about economic growth today, but I do kind of want to make a basic point here, and then I'll leave a little bit of time for questions at the end, and then maybe kick John a couple of extra minutes because I know that he's trying to cram a lot in with his activity to talk about the commons. But one question we might ask is, if property rights tend to become more complete over time, we tend to internalize externalities over time. When do we decide to deal with environmental issues as a society? And that might be globally, it might be nationally, it might be locally, but when do we decide that the benefit of dealing with these things exceeds the cost of doing so? One way to think about this is in the context of this basic idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we really focus on our physiological needs like food and shelter, and then we focus on safety, and then we focus on social needs, and then things more like esteem and self-actualization. And so the point is, certain externalities, it's a matter of how do I want to say this right? At some point, worrying about environmental quality is a little bit of a luxury relative to meeting your basic physiological needs, right? If you are living in sub-Saharan Africa and you don't have access to electricity, or if you're living on the Navajo reservation in northeastern Arizona and you don't have access to electricity, the best way to heat your home might be to burn coal in an open fireplace, which sounds like kind of wild to a lot of us, but that's actually what people do. They burn coal, they burn animal feces, all of these things to meet their really basic physiological needs. Now, those things have environmental consequences. They generate all kinds of externalities. But when you're worried about just heating your home or having electricity or having something to eat, those are the primary things that you worry about. And that's why we tend to see a relationship between economic growth, which is going to meet those basic needs. And once we've met those basic needs, then we can start to worry about some of these externalities that might seem a little bit second order when you're at the bottom of this period. So to kind of illustrate that point, we can think about the change in per capita GDP across time and across countries in human history. So looking at the United States, Canada, France, a bunch of nations across the world, starting in 1500, relatively low per capita GDP and relatively similar per capita GDP with Italy being a notable outlier, but pretty low per capita GDP in the $400 to $500 per person range. Then we see this explosion by, say, 1850, where it's more than quadruple. That's around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And then we see this real takeoff, as particularly for kind of that top half of countries, right, where we go from per capita GDP of like 400 in the year 1500 to 20,000 or nearly 20,000 in the year 1980. And we can see kind of what that's looked like since 1980. So we've had this explosion in living standards, in well-being. This is a way of measuring well-being over time for this top half of countries. But you can see that the bottom half of countries, kind of Mexico on down, they've certainly gained a lot, but they've experienced much smaller gains in per capita GDP than sort of the more developed world. And again, this is a little dated because it stops in 2000, but I think I can actually run it forward to 2018 at least. And we see some of those countries start to catch up. But if you think about, particularly as of 6 years ago, if you think about looking around the world and asking which countries are worrying about environmental pollution, worrying about environmental quality versus which countries tend to do a lot of pollution, tend to have lower environmental quality, it's actually the places that have experienced the most economic growth that are now most focused on environmental quality relative to places like Mexico, Brazil. China has started to really worry about this more recently, but there's still a lot of pretty negative things going on as far as pollution in China. Air quality in India is famously very, 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 very bad in places like Delhi. And so we see this positive relationship, despite the fact that a lot of economic activity, particularly as it pertains to electricity, generates pollution. It's actually the places that have experienced the most economic growth that worry the most and spend the most resources trying to deal with environmental quality or environmental issues. That idea is often referred to as the environmental Kuznets curve. And the idea is that if we think about the relationship between environmental degradation here, so as opposed to quality, this is degradation. So think about that as like negative externalities or pollution would be a good stand in there. As countries grow and develop, so as per capita incomes rise, we first see this period where the environment gets worse, right? We're going to more intensively use resources. We're going to transition from like a pastoral agricultural society and have something that like an industrial revolution. So now we're cutting down trees and burning coal and doing all these things. And there's some degradation that happens with that for sure. And that's kind of us working our way up that pyramid. But then we get to a point where, because our standard of living is so high and all of our basic needs are met, all of a sudden we look around and say, man, it really stinks that the air is so bad and that we have all these health impacts from the dirty air. But we're so wealthy, like, why don't we do something about it? Why don't we have some policies? Why don't we do some things to internalize those externalities? And then as per capita income improves, so does environmental quality, because as we become wealthier and wealthier as a society, we have more and more surplus that we can dedicate towards sort of cleaning up the environment. And so this is kind of a conceptual description, but it's also sort of a stylized fact that we've seen throughout human history, is that as countries develop, they tend to degrade their local environment, but then eventually we see this kind of bending back down of the curve where we actually then start to worry about cleaning up the environment. And this is something that gets talked about a lot in the context of climate change. I don't think I'm going to go into this piece of it this afternoon in my lecture, so I'll talk about it here. Is that right now, the countries that are most concerned about having global policy to address climate change, like the EU, the United States, Japan, are sort of on the backside of this curve, right? Like we have very developed economies, we've experienced all of our growth. And the countries that are doing the most emitting right now are the ones that are still trying to grow, like China and India and places in sub-Saharan Africa. And so there's real kind of tensions and conflict here where you have the developed world who's already experienced like the growth miracle, trying to think about what global emissions should be, while you have these other countries that are still sort of on the upward sloping part of this curve. And eventually we'll get to where it bends back down. But with something like climate change that has these long run impacts, there's real concerns that, we may not bend that curve soon enough. So maybe China and India, et cetera, need to cut back their emissions. But all that to say, this idea looms large, particularly in kind of global environmental challenges, because different countries are at different places on the curve, which creates some interesting political tensions and trade-offs. I think I will leave it there. I have a video on the next slide, but I think it's not super relevant. And I want to leave it there and leave us a few minutes for questions. And if there's not a lot of questions, then I'll hand it to John a couple minutes early. But that was a lot of material, several lectures with material crammed into 40 minutes. So let's have a few minutes for questions.
Brian, you were so clear in how you presented everything. There are zero questions right now. Who's got questions?
Comments are fine too, if folks have. Yeah, Tiffany.
So I was, and I've been through similar environmental courses before, but day to day it clicks for me because I live in a very small coastal community on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and literally I can't afford to live here. I can afford to live here because I rent from family, but the majority of the current home buyers are from out of state. And it's gotten to the point where they're now making people who are part-time residents register their homes because they know they're using them as Airbnbs. And and it's really gotten to a place where I'm fifth generation in this community, but literally cannot afford to live here. And it makes me think about that scarcity of land, because I could move to the county area, which is extremely rural when you literally just walk across the street. But I live in what they consider Old Town, where a 2 bedroom, 1 bath, 1,000 square foot home is $450,000 in Mississippi. So it really shines a light on this when you live in it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's a real, the housing affordability crisis is a real thorny one. And the way it intersects with the environment's kind of is different in different places. But yeah, I'm surprised to hear that even in a place like Mississippi, because like here out west, a lot of the time the issue is that there's a lot of public land. So like we're surrounded by beautiful things, but you can't build. And so there's a real scarcity of where you could potentially hope to build houses. And yeah, it's a tough issue. One of the policies is a little bit outside the scope of today, but one of the policy things that really influences that is zoning and regulations around building, right? And we'll actually kind of see that with an activity this afternoon where there are lots of reasons we might want to regulate where you can build stuff or how you can build stuff, but that makes it more expensive to build. And so then that's gonna, basically housing affordability comes down to the supply of housing. And there's a lot of policies that restrict the supply of housing and make it more expensive. And this is actually, like I said, I spend a lot of time in Bozeman, and like Bozeman is not the same as it was 15 years ago because of the number of people that have lived there. And it's a real interesting tension because you sort of understand the people that have lived there forever and don't want to see subdivisions all around them. But then that makes it even more expensive to live there. And then people that have lived there for multiple generations can't afford to live there anymore. So it's a tough issue to navigate.
Travis posted a question in the chat, Brian. Do you think countries like China really are trying to improve their environment, or are they just tired of catching flack?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We'll talk about this a little bit in the context of climate change, but I do think there is kind of a fundamental truth to the Kuznets curve idea, which is that you get to a point where one, for amenity reasons, but two, just for health impact reasons. I mean, even this is something that's been like stunning to me. Like, I don't really do like air pollution health stuff, but I go to conferences and see people present these papers. We've learned a lot in the last 20 years, maybe even 10 years, about the health impacts of pollution, like long run health impacts, cognitive impacts, things like this. It's really bad for you to breathe polluted air. And like that sounds straightforward, but like we know a lot more about that than we did 20 years ago. And so climate change aside, like the levels of pollution you see in Beijing and places like that, it's not good for them either. Like that amount of pollution has like really significant economic costs that have nothing to do with global externalities. It's going to make your population sicker. It causes degradation to infrastructure. It creates there's huge productivity impacts. That's one of the things that we've learned can really impact productivity. So I think, and right now it's still the case that China is very connected in the global economy, and the countries and the people that China trades with do care about this. And so they're sort of forced to care about it in that way, right? So I think it's a little bit of both. At some point, catching flack increases trade, is going to reduce people's willingness to trade with China if they're like the world's largest emitter and not doing anything about it. So they have an incentive to care to some degree.
Great. Are there any other questions?
All right, you're up, John. M&Ms.
All right, fantastic. Share my screen here. All right, well, I'm John Kessler. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics and Finance at Purdue University's regional campus in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So I saw we had a couple Indiana folks with us, so good to have you guys here. And I've been working with FTE now for, gosh, almost 20 years, it seems like, so getting close. And the activity we're going to do today is one that's easily replicated in your classroom, and we've sort of just made it into the online space here. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow you to stake a claim to a number of M&Ms. And so I have a bag here. I don't know how many of you guys are doing a double screen or not. So let me just stop sharing for a second so I can show you my bag of M&Ms. All right. So I got a great big old bag of M&Ms here. And what we're going to do is we are going to allow you to stake a claim to a certain number of those M&Ms. And so you will get those M&Ms if you claim them. Like obviously, if you're doing this in class, you could actually pass out the M&Ms to students and would have them sort of write it down on a sticky note. What we'll do is we'll just have you type in the chat how many M&Ms you'd like to have. And as long as the total number of M&Ms that are claimed by you all as a group does not exceed the amount of M&Ms that I have in the bag, then we'll give out some prizes. All right. And so there will be a $20 prize given to the person who makes the biggest claim. All right. So if you have the largest number of M&Ms claimed out of the group, you will get $20. The second biggest claim gets $15, and the third largest claim gets $10. But again, the total number of claims cannot exceed what we have in the bag. So go ahead and type in the chat for me how many you would like to have. Thank you. I see those numbers coming in now. All right. Okay, well, I can tell you right now we have already exceeded the total number of M&Ms in the bag. And to prove it to you, I will show you the total number in the bag here. So I wrote on the outside of the bag the total number that's in there. It's 682 M&Ms. Me and my kids had a good time counting those out the other day. And of course, they got rewarded with some M&Ms themselves for their labor. But we have exceeded the total number of M&Ms. So unfortunately, we will not have any payouts for the winners there. So I'm sorry to hear that. So let's talk a little bit about this game and what this shows, right? So number one, what were you thinking about when you were making your claim?
Do you want us to tell out?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was honestly thinking about how many M&Ms there was, and not trying to be greedy and claim too many. I just claimed 10. So
Sure. No, that's fair. Others are saying, hey, I wanted to win the money. Right in the chat. I mean, let's be honest, right? If there's a prize, why not go for the prize if you can? And so, unfortunately, when we think about the rules of the game, right, we'll see they kind of incentivize that, right? So the total claim exceeded the total number of M&Ms because not everybody was being as nice as Jennifer and saying, "Oh, I'm only going to take 10," right, and do that. The other thing is we don't know how many M&Ms there were, right? Like you saw the bag, but you didn't actually know the exact number, right? It would have been easy if we knew exactly how many M&Ms there were. Then, we could, take, Theodore had this idea. Why don't we just like divide it up equally, and then we'll be okay. But without knowing in advance what the number is, it'd be really hard to dictate that. So you're kind of weighing this. Hey, I know I can't ask for too much, but I have to ask for more than everybody else, right? In order to win the prize. So the rules obviously incentivize that with the payout, right? The biggest claim gets the most amount of money, right? So Christy, the total number was 682 M&Ms total in the bag, right? So I did not state that at the beginning. I didn't show you or tell you how many were there. I just showed you the bag, just kind of get a general scale of what it was. So who owned the bag of M&Ms? Well, ultimately, even though I was holding the bag, right, none of you really owned the M&Ms. So if you wanted to own the M&Ms, what did you have to do? So in your class, your students, if they wanted to have some M&Ms, right, in order to get the M&Ms, right, you had to stake a claim, right, but a reasonable amount of them. And especially if you started to pass out the M&Ms first come, first serve, right? So if the first person to stake the claim gets the first number of M&Ms and you just started passing them out in that order until they were all gone, right? They would see how those things would disappear fairly quickly. And you'd have, again, this race to see who can get those M&Ms first, especially if they knew, hey, if I'm last in line, I might not have any for myself, so I better get in there and get it, right? So to establish ownership, you had to stake this claim to it, but because everyone's staking a claim and trying to claim too many, we end up running out of M&Ms fairly quickly. So this is an example of the tragedy of the commons. So a common resource is one in which it's non-excludable, so we can't stop people from entering into the area where the resource is, right? You can't keep people out, so everyone has access to the resource, but it is what we call it's one in which when you use it, there's now less available for others, right? So it's what we call a rivalrous good. So it's non-excludable but rivalrous. So I'm going to have this incentive then to say, hey, if I can't stop other people from going in there and getting the stuff, then I better go and get it while I can before everyone else does, because it's rivalrous and they're getting some means there's less available for me. So we end up with this predictable tragedy of the commons that occurs every time we have these sort of characteristics with a resource, because people start racing in because of the incentives that are created. If you've been to other FTE programs, you might have seen our fish activity that we do. It's similar to this. I like doing that with the students in a face-to-face class where you have goldfish crackers and you put them on a table or something, and you have a couple, 4 or 5 kids come up and you give them a quarter for each one that they get. But if they wait until another round later, they get 50 cents. But because it's a common resource, they kind of rush in there and they kill off all the fish. And there is no round 2 because the fish are all gone, right? So this is just another variation on that type of game. So some examples of common resources in the real world here would be the ocean, right? Up to what is like about 200 nautical miles off the coast of your country. This supposedly like you own that kind of area as a country. Beyond that is international waters in which really nobody owns it. And because of that, we get this tragedy of the commons type activities happening. And so we see overfishing happening in the oceans. And we've been working very hard to try to address those overfishing situations, because they're going to cause some problems for us in the future if we kill off all the fish, right? Then there's clean air and clean water. Like, who owns the air? It's a legitimate question, right? Like, okay, if you go out in your backyard, who owns the air outside your house? Well, kind of you do. But does that mean you can stop an airplane from flying over your house? Well, no. So like, where does that stop exactly? It's kind of hard to say. When I was a kid growing up, maybe some of you remember this, you would go to a restaurant and they actually had a smoking and a non-smoking section, as if the smoke just stayed all in one place or something, right? It never really worked out. So basically we were saying the smokers owned the air, right? That they had the right to use it, and the rest of us just kind of had to put up with it, to the best of our abilities. But once we started hearing about the problems with secondhand smoke and all this kind of stuff, oh yeah, that wall that was kind of a half wall, so that didn't really have the air coming through. Richard, that's a great point. So now, though, the assumption is in most places the non-smoker owns the air, right? Because of the health problems that were created by secondhand smoke, we've changed the rules. And so now the assumption is if you want to smoke, you got to go outside and do it. I mean, most places are non-smoking establishments, of course, with casinos and bars maybe being an exception in those cases. With water, right? Who owns the water is a legitimate question. And they have different rules and different laws in different parts of the country, depending upon what they want to do for ownership and access to the water. And depending upon what those rules are, right, the incentives will be different on how to treat that water, whether to pollute it, to overuse it, all of these sorts of things. Then there's wildlife and wildflowers. In your state or your community, who owns the wildlife? And if in Indiana, a farmer has a deer on his land, can he just shoot the deer because he wants to, or does he have to get a permit from the state? And that rule or might be different in different parts of the country, depending upon where you're at, right? In most cases, we've said, okay, the wildlife belongs to the state. And so you have to go and get a permit to go and hunt. And that way, yeah, so that's why we have the game wardens, to make sure we don't have poaching happening and too many animals being killed, because we set sort of a limit on how many permits we're going to give out based on the biology of the animals and how much the land can support and this kind of stuff, to make sure we don't, again, like the fish cracker game or the M&Ms, end up killing off all the wildlife. One of the best summers I had in college was actually in 2001. My wife and I were in college together, and we decided to go work in Grand Teton National Park for the summer. I had had the opportunity to work in Glacier National Park before I joined the Marine Corps, and had told her a bunch of stories about it. So she said, "Okay, let's go do that too." So we went off to the Tetons, and so here's a picture I'm showing you here of the view from the backside of Jackson Lake Lodge in Grand Teton National Park. I did not take this picture, but this is one I found online that was of that view. And this field of flowers is right there. And my job that summer, they found out I was in the Marines. So they're like, "Hey, you should be a security guard for us at the hotel." And I kind of laughed. I said, "Well, you may not realize, but I was actually a trumpet player in the band in the Marines. So I don't know if you really want me to be a security guard." They're like, close enough. So they made me a security guard in the at the hotel. But I soon found out why it didn't matter that I was in the band, because my job was merely to walk around the hotel and tell people to stop harassing the moose and don't pick the flowers. Right? That was it. And so it was a fairly easy summer. And you can imagine, right? The reason why we don't want people picking the flowers is because if you allow them to do it, all it will take is one season and those flowers will be gone, and we won't have any more wildflowers for other people to enjoy. And it worked perfectly fine until one day, young girl was frolicking through the field and picking flowers and bringing bouquets of flowers to her daddy and showing off. And I had to be the one to go over and tell him, "Sorry, your daughter can't be picking flowers." And he got very upset with me and started like poking me in the chest, saying like, "Hey, I pay my taxes and my daughter can do what she wants in this area." I was like, "Okay, sir, that's fine. If that's how you want to play it, I'll just call the park rangers and they're going to come over and they're going to fine you for every flower that she picked." And so then at that point, he's like, "Oh, honey, go put the flowers back," right? So once you change the rules and tell them, "Hey, you can't just do this for free. Like there's a cost associated with it, because if we don't have a cost associated with it, people will just go run rampant and take all this out, and we won't be able to enjoy it in the future." So we don't want that to happen, right? Then we've got the beach. The beach is great if you get there super early in the morning or go there late in the day and everyone's gone home. But in the middle of the day, it's crowded on some beaches, right? It all depends on where you go and what time of year. But that's a tragedy of the commons, right? Because everyone can go to these public beaches, right? It gets overrun with folks. And then I remember going to Santa Monica Beach with my kids one summer. I was doing an FTE program at UCLA, and just the amount of garbage and everything that was on the beach, it was really astounding to me at this public beach. Then of course there's the freeway. The interstate can be great if it's not rush hour traffic, but because we don't, it's free access to anyone to go onto the road, right? At certain times it can feel like a tragedy of the commons because too many people are using it, and so we get stuck in traffic. Then there's our sort of perception of what we want to have when we go on vacation, right? So this is sort of what we imagine, a little romantic gondola ride through Venice, right? If we went over there to visit, but the reality when you get there is it's super crowded and there's a ton of people that are out there. So some of the guidebooks I've read, again, were saying, "Hey, get up super early in the morning and get out there before all the tour buses show up, because otherwise this is the experience you're going to have in those areas." The race to get overhead bin space on the airlines has been kind of a crazy experience. This is especially if you ever flew Southwest Airlines, right? They've of course recently changed their policy. As you know, they're going to now have assigned seats on Southwest Airlines, but previously, before they did, there was a big rush to see who could get on there first. So they tried to alleviate that by having you line up by numbers, right? But even so, then there was a big, hey, I'm going to pay more to get in the front so that I can get my luggage on there. Since they weren't charging luggage fees, right? People wanted to race on there and get it. Then, of course, there's your high school cafeteria. Who owns the cafeteria? Well, the kids will certainly tell you they don't. Right. And every time I remember when I was teaching in Arizona, I would tell the students, you guys really got to take some pride in your school and like pick up after yourself or whatever. The response was always, oh, come on, man, that's job security for the janitors. I don't want to take their job. Like, that'd be terrible. So you just kind of like throw up your hands like, okay, if that's the way you're going to think about it. But because there's no ownership really involved there, if they're not going to take ownership by having pride in their school, then what else do you do, right? How do you get them to not just leave all their garbage everywhere? Right? Lots of different examples of common resources all over the world, and some of which we get a chance to experience, some of which we don't, but depending upon, because they're common resources, the incentives are still the same. Right? You can't stop people from accessing it. And in many cases, if you use it, other people can't. So there ends up being a race to see who can get those resources first. And so we get this tragedy of the commons that occurs. The most famous example, of course, of this in American history is the story of the American bison, right? So we're all probably familiar with what happened with the bison early on. I remember, I was a history minor in college. I taught U.S. history for a while, and one of my favorite eras of American history was, the 19th century American West, and starting with Lewis and Clark, and read the journals of Lewis and Clark and just the stories they would say, like how many animals they would see on the plains. One story said that there was a herd of bison that was probably 5 miles wide, and it started and it took 5 days for the herd of bison to go by their encampment. And I just can't imagine just the massive amount of bison that were there. Well, shortly after, of course, the Civil War ends, people start moving out west. And in a very short period of time, we start to see the bison population shrinking rapidly, right? From 1870 to 1875, killing off about 13 million bison in that period. And of course, all kinds of different reasons for this. One, just population growth happening. People got to eat. You got the army out there that's got to eat. You got the army fighting the Native Americans who are trying to kill off their food source as just sort of a tactic. You've got the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and trying to feed the railroad workers. You've got the bison being sort of a nuisance to the railroads. And so they're just shooting the bison for sport and just having fun with it. We end up, of course, with about 150 bison left in Yellowstone National Park and on private ranches around the country. And of course, with Yellowstone, we just sort of surround them with the army and say, if you come near them, we'll shoot you. So don't do that. And then we're able to now start to see the bison start coming back. But even someone as environmentally conscious as Teddy Roosevelt, right? When the guy started the National Park Service, he even said, right, the bison are going away. I better get out there and kill one before they're gone. Right. He's a hunter. I want to hunt one of these things, and I better go get one because they're going to be extinct soon. And you can go to the Smithsonian in D.C. and you can see the bison that Teddy Roosevelt got, right? And so the incentives are the problem here ultimately at the end of the day. So again, a painting of what was going on with the bison and the railroads, just shooting them as sport just to kind of get rid of them and get them off the tracks and out of the way. You had just the sheer number being killed is kind of hard to imagine. This is just the heads of the bison stacked up, just going to get the magnitude of how many were being killed at this time. And of course, the Native Americans were also hunting the bison too, right? So they're people too. They respond to incentives in predictable ways, and they found very quickly that if you're riding your horse at 30 miles an hour next to a stampeding herd of bison, it's super dangerous. So what's a lot easier is let's just run the whole herd off a cliff, and we'll just kill the whole herd at once, and then go find another herd, right? And so this is a place in Alberta, Canada, that you can visit. It's a national monument up there, and the English translation of the Native American name of this place is Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump. And so you can go to Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump National Monument in Alberta, Canada, and visit this place where they would just run the herds of bison off the cliff. So everyone was doing this because, again, to own the bison, you had to kill the bison, right? And so the tragedy of the commons is the problem. So what do we do about it? If we got this issue of a non-excludable but rivalrous resource where there's a race to use it up, there's a couple different things that we can do, right? There's the typical economic idea of a Pigovian tax, named after a guy named A.C. Pigou, who first came up with these sorts of ideas, where the government could tax people who were using the resource, and that tax, of course, increases the price and would reduce the quantity that's being consumed. Then you could regulate the resource. Again, that's what we try to do with hunting permits and these sorts of things. But another example of what we could do is we could privatize the common resource, right? Give ownership of the resource to someone or some entity, and that would then create an incentive for them to figure out ways to protect those resources. So property rights can stop the tragedy of the commons because of this profit motive now that gets introduced. If you own the property, you want to make sure that it doesn't disappear so that you can have a continuous stream of income into the future, right? So this picture here shows the dividing line of this barbed wire fence between private ranch and public grazing land. And so you see on the right with the public grazing land, it gets overused, but on the left with the private land, the rancher has an incentive to rotate the herd so that they're not, killing off all of the food sources for the future for them. So in order for this to work, right, if you want to make the property rights work to help with the tragedy of the commons, there's a few things that have to be true for these to be the case. And the first thing is everyone has to know who owns the stuff, right? If we don't clearly define and delineate who owns what, it gets confusing for people. And wherever there's a gray area, that's where the most destructive things are going to happen. Right. So if we know who owns it, we know what the incentives are, we'll stay out of it. But if we don't know, cool, that's the place I'm going to go in and I'm going to start using the resource there. There's a guy named Hernando de Soto, who's a Peruvian economist, and he wrote a book called The Mystery of Capital. And he talks about why capital is easily accessible in the West, but not so easily accessible to developing countries. And basically, he boils it down to this issue of property rights. Because we have strong property rights in a place like the United States, then we are able to leverage that for debt to borrow, to invest into businesses and these sorts of things to grow our economy. Where in areas where they're not defined and we don't know who owns it, you can't go to a bank then and say, hey, can I have a loan and I can use this as collateral for the debt. So he was hired by the country of Cambodia to come over and help them figure out how to do this, right? So like we know that this institution works. The hard part is how do you give that to a country that doesn't already have it, right? So like in America, we go all the way back to like the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and go, okay, we've been mapping the United States basically from the beginning. So property rights for us are just sort of taken for granted, right? It's like, oh, this is sort of the air we breathe, right? It's like it's just always been there. So we don't really think about it until there's a problem with it, right? And so but in Cambodia, they didn't have this strong defined property rights. And so they invited the expert, right? Come and tell us what we have to do to establish these property rights. And so he was there visiting for a while and thinking about this problem. And what he eventually said to them is, you have to listen to the barking dogs. And they kind of laughed, like, what are you talking about? He says, well, I was out for a walk the other day, and I was walking in this rice field and along this berm, and I noticed that this dog just kept barking at me. And then I went over the berm and started walking on a different area, and that dog stopped barking, and a different dog started barking at me. And then the aha moment, right? Oh, you may not know who owns the stuff, but the dogs know. who owns the stuff, right? And if I was on their owner's property, they were worried, but as soon as I left their property, they stopped worrying about me, right? And so it's this idea that literally you have to walk the land and talk to the people who are living in those areas, because while you as the government may not have codified this and written it down and know exactly who owns what, the people living in those areas have already come up with agreements amongst themselves of who's going to own what, right? So all you need to do as the government official is just walk around and talk to people and ask them, right? Who owns this? Who owns that? And then you write it down and say, okay, now because we, the government, have agreed with you that this is, we're going to allow you to own this, we're also then going to protect those property rights, right? The government now can come in and enforce those property rights for people because they've agreed with the community of who owns what. So once you have them defined and everyone knows who owns what, you got to have some entity who can come along and enforce those agreements amongst the people, because of course we don't want we want to reduce conflict whenever we possibly can, right? If we have a situation where people have to fight amongst themselves, we're actually increasing conflict. So if we can have an outside force who can come along and say, hey, here's the agreement, here's the contract, this will be enforced, people end up not fighting because they already know what the outcome will be if they start fighting in the beginning, right? So someone's got to enforce it. So we need a strong government who has the ability to do that. Then, of course, you got to be able to exclude people from your property, right? How do you then stop access to the property? And I think personally, when I think about the tragedy of the commons, because it's got this sort of non-excludable nature to the resource, this is probably the hardest part in dealing with this. I would assume that if you get ownership of it, great. How now are you going to stop people from getting access to it, right? Just because you own it doesn't mean people are just going to go, oh, cool, all right, now we're not going to do it. So in some cases, there might be some difficulties there, but because of the profit motive, you've got an incentive to figure that out, right? How do we actually exclude people? And sometimes this ends up being more of a technological problem, right? We have to have a technological innovation of some kind to make it easier or cheaper to create property rights. So like out in the Great Plains, when you had the bison roaming around, to establish ownership of them, you had to kill them, because the only other option would be, well, I got to build a fence of some kind to keep them in. Well, there's not really natural resources there that make that cheap. There's not a whole lot of trees and stuff that you can cut down and build a fence. And you got to build them like 6 feet high because the bison will get out if you don't. And so it wasn't until the invention of barbed wire that we really found a cheap way to establish property rights over large areas of land out west, right? And so the same thing with the oceans. How do you build a fence in the middle of the ocean, right? You a bunch of buoys or something and just kind of put up barbed wire out there in the ocean floating around. Well, it's probably not going to work, right? You got tides and stuff that'll cause problems. So it took the invention of global positioning satellites, right? The GPS locators. Now, while we can draw imaginary lines on the ocean, and we can keep track of you and where you go. And so we can know, all right, you come back with the fish that you've caught, you come to offload it, and you can have someone there who says, all right, let me see your GPS. And as long as you didn't turn it off and you stayed within the boundaries that were established for you, then great, you get to keep your catch. And if not, then of course you've got the government or someone there to enforce that. And there's fines and other things that you can have to disincentivize people from fishing in areas that they don't. But again, the ocean's a huge place. Poaching still a problem. How do you stop that? That's still an issue that we've got to solve. All right. So then lastly, it's got to be transferable. You got to have a way of trading it, buying it, selling it, giving it away, right? In order to really own something, you've got to have the ability to do this. And so as long as it's clearly defined, it's enforceable, it's excludable, and it's transferable, then we would say you have strong property rights, and that will then create incentives for people to treat those common resources differently because of that change in ownership. And so we can tax it, we can regulate it, we can privatize it, depending upon what it is and what the cheapest, easiest, best way is for that particular issue. We have multiple ways that we can address these problems. Okay. So with the bison, At least the numbers that I've seen, and maybe Brian, if you've got updated info because you're out there in Buffalo land, right in Wyoming, you can help me out here. But I know there's about 20,000 bison last I saw that were on government-owned property between like Teddy Roosevelt National Monument, Yellowstone, Custer State Park, these sorts of places. And they keep it at about that level because of just the biology of that area, right? The ability for the land to actually sustain a population. They try to limit that. For the longest time in Yellowstone, I had a chance to go fishing with the retired superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, and he told me that they would go out in the wintertime and they would go and kill bison and elk and stuff. The park rangers would go hunt them because there was no natural predator to keep the population in check, and so to keep it at that number, they would have to do that. So that was one of the incentives, of course, for reintroducing the wolves and stuff into the Yellowstone ecosystem, was to help out with that. So the numbers I saw, and there's probably even larger than this today, was that there are about 4,000 private ranches growing bison, and there was over 500,000 bison, and to the point now where we're selling bison meat in your grocery store that you can go and purchase, right? And so we gave ownership of the bison, created a profit motive, and now instead of having the incentive to go in and kill off all the bison as fast as you can, you have an incentive to expand the population of bison because you can profit off of having more of them available to us. One of my colleagues does a lot of research in the economics of space. And he and I had talked quite a bit recently about this idea of outer space as a common resource. Like, who owns outer space? So when we launch these satellites into space, we have now all this space junk that floats around because the satellites don't last forever. And sometimes they bump into each other and break up into little pieces and things. And so who's responsible for cleaning up that mess? And if no one owns it, how do we enforce that and make people go and do that? And then you've got the problem here, of course, of technology. How easy is it to go and collect a centimeter, long piece of metal that's traveling at thousands of miles per hour? Good luck, right? In grabbing that. But there is I know there's a company in South Korea that's actually doing some research on creating the ability to actually go and collect these pieces out of outer space and clean up the garbage. So again, is property rights going to solve that problem? Maybe we can come up with some way of using that. We might need to use regulations and taxes, tax people who are launching satellites into space so that we can accumulate money that we'll then use to clean up the garbage later once we have the technology to do so. It's one of the areas where they're doing research right now about this common resource area. Okay, so in summary, when we think about it, resources who are owned in common tend to be overused. So basically, if everyone owns it, it's as if nobody owns it because no one really has an incentive to take care of it. And the way of fixing that, of course, can be taxes, can be regulation, or putting in property rights that hopefully are clearly defined, enforceable, excludable, and transferable. When we do that, then that should help. And we have lots of examples of where that has helped in areas with like elephants in South Africa and these sorts of things that have been very, very helpful. So private property rights are going to penalize anybody who tries to overuse the resource because they won't be able to profit from it in the future. And it's going to reward people who take care of those things because now they'll have continuous income off into the future, and they can actually take into consideration today the concerns of people into the future, right? So if you think on your piece of land that maybe you have that people really like apple orchards, well, you could plant a bunch of apple trees that you may never actually see the fruit of because you plan on selling that property sooner rather than later. But if other people like apple trees, what happens? The property values increase. And so you as an individual have an incentive to consider what other people want in your property and maintaining it and taking care of it, this sort of stuff, because you can get some of that benefit yourself today when you sell the property now with increased property values and those sorts of things. Okay. All right. So that is the M&M activity and a bit of the tragedy of the commons. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns? So Christy, you said you have a half dozen bison in the park near you. Where's that at?
We're in Southwest Virginia, between Tennessee and Kentucky, over by Cumberland Gap.
Oh, great. So which park is it?
It's Wilderness Road Park, but I believe it is a part of, and Emily, if you correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's a part of Jefferson National Forest.
Oh, part of the National Forest. Okay, great. Yeah, I know we've got a few here near Fort Wayne in a state park. Wabash State Park has a pen with bison in it that people can go and check out as well. Great.
When I was a kid, about an hour from where I am, my uncle worked on a ranch that had bison. Decent number. I can't remember. I was a kid, but yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, very cool. So the picture I showed you was of Ted Turner, of course, of TNT Television, CNN, former owner of the Atlanta Braves, who last I'd seen was the largest single landowner in America, owned more acres of land than anyone other than the U.S. government and the Nature Conservancy, right? And he was using his land to grow, bison and stuff, and then created Ted's Montana Grill restaurant, so he'd have a way to profit off of that and sell the meat to the public. And so again, you see that profit motive kicking in those areas to help private ranchers be incentivized to do it. Even when we only had like 150 bison left, right? The reason why some of those private ranchers had captured those bison were because they thought, ooh, if I had the last bison, people will pay a lot of money to come see it or take a picture with it or whatever. So even they were thinking in a profit motivated sort of way at that time to conserve the resource even as it was dying off.